Imagine standing in your dream kitchen, 7 months pregnant, and having the man you love hand you divorce papers while your mother's funeral flowers are still fresh. For Vivian, the sound of her life shattering wasn't a metaphor. It was the literal crash of a casserole dish hitting Italian marble floors. But what her billionaire husband didn't know was that while he was trying to discard her like a nobody, she was about to become the most powerful woman in his world. The kitchen still smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic, a meal she had spent hours preparing even though her back ached and her feet were swollen. Vivian had always believed that love lived in the little things. Home-cooked dinners, handwritten notes, quiet patience. She didn't hear Grant walk in at first. His footsteps were too measured, too calm, like he was entering a boardroom instead of his home. "Vivian," he said, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. She turned slowly, one hand resting on her belly. The baby shifted inside her, as if sensing the tension before she could. "You're early," she said softly, trying to smile. "I made your favorite. We need to talk." For words. Cold. Clean. Final. Something inside her tightened. Grant didn't sit. He didn't take off his coat. He simply walked to the kitchen island and placed a thin envelope on the marble surface, sliding it toward her like it was nothing more than a business document. Vivian stared at it, her fingers trembling before she even touched it. "What is this? You should read it." Her heart began to pound, loud enough that she could barely hear the silence in the room. Slowly, carefully, she opened the envelope. The words blurred at first. Legal language. Signatures. Terms. And then it hit her. Divorce. Her grip loosened. The casserole dish slipped from her hands and shattered against the floor, the sound echoing through the massive kitchen like a gunshot. She didn't even flinch. This isn't real," she whispered. Grant exhaled, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "It is." Vivian looked up at him, searching his face for something, anything familiar. The man standing in front of her looked like her husband, but his eyes were distant, detached. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice breaking. 7 months, Grant. "I'm aware." "Then how can you? This isn't working anymore." Not working. Like their marriage was a broken contract. Like she was a failed investment. Vivian shook her head slowly. "We can fix this. Whatever it is, we can talk, we can." "There's nothing to fix." The words sliced through her. A heavy silence followed, thick with everything he wasn't saying. And then she saw it. Not in his words, not in his tone, but in his lack of emotion. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just decision. Vivian swallowed hard. "Is there someone else?" For the first time, Grant hesitated. But it wasn't out of shame, it was calculation. "Yes." The room tilted. Vivian grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. Her heart didn't just break. It cracked open piece by piece, leaving something hollow behind. "Who?" she whispered. Grant didn't answer immediately, and somehow that silence told her everything. Her breath caught. "No." She shook her head, backing away slightly. "No, it's not. Delaney." The name hit harder than anything else. Vivian felt the air leave her lungs completely. Delaney. Her best friend. The woman who had sat beside her at her mother's funeral just days ago, holding her hand, whispering that everything would be okay. The woman who had cried with her, comforted her, promised her she wasn't alone. A sharp, broken laugh escaped Vivian's lips. "This is a joke," she said, though her voice trembled. "This has to be a joke." "It's not." "How long?" Grant didn't respond. "How long, Grant?" she demanded louder this time. 14 months. 14 months. More than a year. Vivian's mind raced, trying to piece together every memory, every moment that suddenly felt like a lie. The dinners. The holidays. The nights Delaney had stayed over, laughing in this very kitchen. All of it fake. Her chest tightened painfully. "And you were just going to what?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Replace me? Like I'm nothing." Grant rubbed his temple, clearly irritated now. "Vivian, let's not make this emotional." "Not emotional." She let out a hollow laugh. I'm carrying your child, she said. My mother just died. And you bring me divorce papers in the middle of my kitchen, and you don't want this to be emotional? He didn't respond, because to him it wasn't. That was the moment something shifted inside her. Not healed, not strong, but aware. Aware that the man she loved didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never did. Grant straightened slightly, returning to that businesslike tone. I've made arrangements for you. Vivian wiped her tears quickly, her expression slowly hardening. Arrangements. A studio apartment. Fully furnished. And I'll provide $12,000 a month in support. She blinked at him. $12,000, she repeated. It's more than enough. More than enough. For a billionaire it was nothing. For a wife carrying his child it was an insult. Vivian stared at him, really seeing him now. Not the man she married, but the man he had become. Cold. Calculated. Arrogant. You really think I'm that small? She said quietly. Grant sighed. I think you're not built for conflict, Vivian. And that's okay. This is the simplest way forward. Simplest. For him. Vivian looked down at the papers in her hand. Her entire life reduced to signatures and numbers. For a moment she said nothing. And Grant mistook her silence for defeat. You don't have to decide right now, he added almost dismissively. But I'd prefer if this didn't drag out. Of course he would. Because dragging it out might mean facing consequences. Vivian slowly placed the papers back on the counter. Her hand stopped shaking. Her breathing steadied. And when she looked up again, something in her eyes had changed. Not strength. Not yet. But something quieter. Something deeper. Okay, she said softly. Grant frowned slightly, surprised by her calm response. Okay. I'll sign. Relief flickered across his face, quick and unguarded. Good, he said. That's the smart decision. Smart. Vivian almost smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking like the woman he believed she was. She turned away from him, stepping carefully around the broken glass on the floor. Just give me a little time, she said. I need to process everything. Grant nodded. Take the night. The night. As if grief could be scheduled. As if betrayal had a deadline. Vivian walked out of the kitchen without another word. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Because something inside her had gone completely still. That night, she sat alone in their bedroom, surrounded by a life that suddenly didn't feel like hers. The walls were the same. The furniture was the same. But everything meant something different now. Every corner held a memory that felt contaminated. She placed a hand over her belly, feeling the faint movement of her baby. I'm here, she whispered softly. I'm still here. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks, silent and steady. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. Hours passed. Grant never came to check on her. Of course he didn't. He had already moved on. Vivian eventually stood and walked to the closet. She didn't pack everything. She didn't even try. Instead, she chose only 4 things. Her mother's cardigan. A simple, soft piece of fabric that still smelled faintly like lavender. A cast-iron skillet. Because her mother had always said, no matter where life takes you, you should always be able to cook your own meal. The baby's ultrasound. A reminder that something pure still existed in her world. And finally, the envelope. The one she hadn't opened yet. It had arrived earlier that day, buried under condolence cards and sympathy notes. She hadn't had the strength to look at it before. But now there was nothing left to lose. Vivian sat back down on the edge of the bed, staring at it for a long moment. Her mother's name was written across the front. Eleanor Hayes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a letter. And something else. Something official. Legal. Her heart began to race again. But this time it felt different. Not fear. Something else. Something unknown. She unfolded the letter first. Her mother's handwriting filled the page, familiar and comforting. Vivian took a deep breath and began to read. Vivian's eyes moved slowly across the page, her breath catching at the very first line. My dearest Vivian, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to explain everything to you in person. And for that, I am truly sorry. Her vision blurred instantly. No, she whispered, shaking her head as if her mother might somehow hear her. Her fingers tightened around the paper, but she kept reading. There are truths about our family that I have hidden from you your entire life. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted you to grow up free. Free from expectations, from greed, and from the weight that money can place on a person's soul. Vivian's heartbeat began to quicken. You knew me as a piano teacher, a woman who clipped coupons and drove an old car. But that was only one part of my story. The truth is, I was born Eleanor Hargrove. Vivian froze. Hargrove. The name echoed in her mind like a distant bell. She had heard it before. Not in her home, but in business headlines, in conversations Grant used to have with his investors, in the quiet admiration people reserved for old money power. The Hargrove Industrial Group, one of the most powerful, most private corporate dynasties in the country. Her hand started shaking again. No, that's not possible, she whispered. But the letter didn't stop. Yes, my love. The Hargroves are my family. And by blood, they are yours too. Vivian's chest rose and fell rapidly now. All those years, all those quiet, simple moments, none of it matched what she was reading. I left that world when I was younger than you are now. My father believed money was power, and power meant control. I refused to live that way. So I walked away, with nothing but my dignity and the promise that I would raise my child differently. A tear slipped down Vivian's cheek. That sounded exactly like her mother. Strong, quiet, unshakable. But even though I left, I did not leave you unprotected. Vivian's eyes dropped to the second document in the envelope. A thick, formal statement. Numbers. Legal seals. Her breath caught. I created a trust in your name the day you were born. I managed it quietly, carefully, growing it over the years. Not for luxury, not for status, but for security, for freedom. Her heart pounded louder now. She scanned the document quickly, desperately, and then she saw it. The number. 4,200,000,000. 4.2 billion. Vivian's entire body went still. Her mind refused to process it. No, she said under her breath. No, that's not real. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. But the number didn't change. It didn't disappear. It stayed there, bold and undeniable. $4.2 billion. Her breath came in shallow waves now. Her mother, her simple, kind, gentle mother, had been hiding something this massive her entire life. By the time you read this, everything will legally belong to you, the letter continued. Vivian pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to steady herself. But listen to me carefully, Vivian. This money is not your worth. It never has been. And it never will be. Tears streamed freely now. You were already enough the day you were born. Kindness, resilience, integrity. Those are things no one can take from you. Not even the people who hurt you the most. Grant's face flashed in her mind. Cold. Distant. Unrecognizable. There may come a day when someone makes you feel small. When they try to measure your value by what you have, or what you don't. When that day comes, I want you to remember this. Your strength was built long before this money ever existed. Vivian let out a shaky breath. It felt like her mother was speaking directly into her soul. Use this gift wisely. Build something meaningful. Protect yourself. And never let anyone convince you that you are anything less than extraordinary. The letter ended with a final line that broke her completely. I love you always. Mom. Vivian lowered the paper slowly. The room was silent again. But everything had changed. Completely. She sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The divorce papers still sat on the other side of the room. The life she had known still technically existed. But now she saw it differently. Grant thought she was weak, naive, dependent. A woman who would quietly accept whatever scraps he gave her. Vivian looked down at the legal document again. $4.2 billion. The irony almost made her laugh. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. Freedom. Not revenge. Not power. Freedom. For the first time since Grant walked into that kitchen, Vivian didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel small. She felt still, grounded, awake. The next morning, the sun rose gently over Manhattan, casting soft light through the tall windows of the penthouse. Vivian stood in the living room dressed simply. No makeup. No effort to impress. Just calm. Grant walked out of his office adjusting his watch. He glanced at her briefly, then paused. Something about her felt different. "You're up early," he said. Vivian nodded slightly. "I couldn't sleep." He didn't ask why. Instead, his eyes moved to the table. "The divorce papers. Have you made a decision?" he asked. Straight to the point. "Of course." Vivian walked toward the table slowly, her movements steady and controlled. "I have." She picked up the pen. Grant watched her closely, expecting hesitation. But there was none. She signed her name. Clean. Simple. Final. And just like that, their marriage ended. Grant exhaled quietly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "Good," he said. "This is better for both of us." Vivian looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't feel anything. No anger, no love, no pain, just clarity. "I hope it is," she said softly. Grant gathered the papers, already mentally moving on. "I'll have my assistant coordinate your move," he added. "The apartment will be ready by tomorrow." Vivian shook her head gently. "That won't be necessary." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I won't be moving into the apartment." A pause. Grant studied her now, a hint of confusion in his expression. "Then where will you go?" Vivian picked up her small bag. "I'm going home." "Home?" he repeated. "You mean Virginia?" She nodded. Grant let out a quiet scoff. "That's not practical, Vivian. You'll need to be in the city for appointments, especially with the baby coming." "I'll manage." Her tone was calm. Too calm. Grant narrowed his eyes slightly. "You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be." Vivian met his gaze. "I'm not." A silence stretched between them. For a brief moment, something unfamiliar crossed Grant's face. Uncertainty. But it disappeared just as quickly. "Fine," he said. "Do whatever you think is best." Vivian gave a small nod. "I will." And with that, she walked past him. No hesitation. No looking back. Just forward. The drive to Virginia felt longer than usual. Not because of the distance, but because of everything she was leaving behind. Or maybe, everything she had already left. Vivian kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting gently on her belly. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the baby or to herself. The city faded behind her. Skyscrapers turned into open roads. Noise turned into silence. And for the first time in weeks, Vivian could breathe. Her mother's apartment looked exactly the same. Small, simple, familiar. The faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air. Vivian stepped inside slowly, her chest tightening as memories flooded back. Every corner held a piece of her childhood. Every object carried meaning. This place. This was home. Not the penthouse. Not the luxury. This. She placed her bag down and walked to the window. Sunlight streamed in, warm and gentle. Tears filled her eyes again. But this time, they weren't just from pain. They were from something else. Relief. Days turned into weeks. Vivian didn't rush. She didn't make any big decisions. She simply existed. She cooked. She cleaned. She rested. She read her mother's letter over and over again, each time understanding it a little more. The money sat untouched. She didn't spend it. Didn't even look at it beyond what she already knew. 'Cause right now, she didn't need it. What she needed was herself. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Grant Whitmore's world continued exactly as he had planned, or so he thought. He moved Delaney into the penthouse within days. She filled the space with laughter, expensive taste, and a kind of energy that felt exciting at first. Grant returned to his routine. Meetings, deals, expansion plans. Everything moved forward. Clean, efficient, controlled. But slowly, small cracks began to form. At first they were easy to ignore. A delayed contract. An investor asking more questions than usual. A partner hesitating before signing. Grant brushed it off. Business always had fluctuations. But then, something unexpected happened. One of his senior legal advisors walked into his office with a look Grant had never seen before. Concern. "We have a problem," the man said. Grant leaned back in his chair. "What kind of problem?" The advisor placed a file on the desk. "The prenuptial agreement." Grant's expression didn't change. "What about it?" A pause. "It was never filed." Silence. For the first time in a long time, Grant didn't respond immediately. "What do you mean it wasn't filed?" he asked slowly. "It means," the advisor hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "legally, it doesn't exist." The room felt colder suddenly. Grant sat up straight. "That's not possible. I've checked multiple times." Grant's jaw tightened. "Fix it." The advisor shook his head. "We can't fix something that was never completed." A heavy silence filled the room. And for the first time, Grant felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something dangerous. Doubt. Grant didn't speak for a long time after his legal advisor left the office. The file remained open on his desk, the words staring back at him like a quiet accusation. The prenuptial agreement does not exist. For years he had built his life on control. Every deal calculated, every risk measured, every outcome predicted. And yet this was a mistake he didn't see coming. His fingers tapped slowly against the desk, a habit he had whenever something slipped outside his control. "Call them back," he finally said to his assistant. Within hours, his entire legal team was sitting across from him. The room felt tense, uncertain. Grant looked at each of them, his expression sharp. "Explain how this happened." There were exchanged glances. Silence. Then one of them spoke carefully. "There was a filing delay during the original submission. It required a final signature confirmation that was never completed." Grant's eyes narrowed. "And no one thought to follow up?" "We believed it had been handled," another added quickly. "Believed." Grant let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't a small oversight," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is exposure." Because now, everything he owned, everything he had built, was no longer protected. At first, Grant told himself it didn't matter. Vivian wasn't the type to fight. She was quiet, emotional, passive. She had already signed the divorce papers without argument. In his mind, the situation was still under control. But control is often just an illusion before reality catches up. It started with a call from one of his investors, a man who had trusted Grant for years. "I've been hearing things," the investor said. Grant frowned. "About what?" "A situation, your personal life, and how it might affect the company." Grant's tone sharpened. "My personal life has nothing to do with business." "It usually doesn't," the investor replied calmly. "But instability at the top makes people nervous." Nervous. That word lingered. And in business, nervous people don't invest. They pull back. Then came the second call. A partner delaying a major deal. Then a third. A contract suddenly under review. At first, each issue seemed separate, manageable, explainable. But when they started piling up, a pattern began to form. And Grant hated patterns he didn't control. At home, things weren't as seamless as he expected either. Delaney had fully settled into the penthouse. She brought a new energy into the space, louder, brighter, more demanding. First, it felt refreshing. different from Vivian's quiet presence. But difference doesn't always mean better. "Why are you so distracted lately?" Delaney asked one evening, watching him scroll through emails at the dinner table. "I'm working," Grant replied without looking up. "You're always working." He sighed. "That's how things run." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, things shouldn't feel this tense all the time." Grant finally looked at her. "Tense?" he repeated. "Yes," she said. "Ever since everything happened." Everything happened, a vague phrase for something very real. Grant didn't respond, because deep down, he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Meanwhile, miles away in Virginia, Vivian's life had taken on a completely different rhythm. There were no urgent calls, no contracts, no expectations, just quiet mornings, soft afternoons, and slow healing nights. She would wake up early, open the windows, and let fresh air fill the apartment. Sometimes she played her mother's old piano, not perfectly, but enough to feel connected. Each note felt like a memory, each melody like a conversation with someone she missed deeply. The money still sat untouched. $4.2 billion. A number so large it didn't feel real. But Vivian didn't rush toward it. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing security. She was rebuilding herself. One afternoon, she sat at the small kitchen table, her mother's letter in front of her again. But this time, she wasn't reading it as someone broken. She was reading it as someone waking up. Her eyes paused on one line. "Use this gift wisely. Build something meaningful." Vivian leaned back in her chair, her hand resting gently on her belly. Build something meaningful. Not destroy. Not prove a point. Not seek revenge. Build. A small, thoughtful smile touched her lips. "Okay, Mom," she whispered. "I think I understand now." Back in Manhattan, Grant's situation was no longer subtle. It was visible, public, and impossible to ignore. A major investor pulled out completely. News began to circulate, quietly at first, then louder. Concerns about leadership. Questions about decision-making. Doubts. The kind that spread faster than facts. Grant found himself working longer hours, pushing harder, trying to stabilize everything at once. But the more he pushed, the more resistance he faced. Because pressure doesn't fix cracks. It exposes them. One evening, he stood alone in the penthouse living room. The city lights stretched endlessly outside the windows. This had always been his symbol of success. Power, achievement, control. But now, it felt different. Empty. Delaney was out. The silence was heavy. Grant poured himself a drink, staring at the reflection of the city in the glass. And for the first time in years, he thought about Vivian, not as an inconvenience, not as a chapter he had closed, but as something he might have misunderstood completely. Days later, he made a decision he hadn't planned to make. He called her. In Virginia, Vivian's phone rang softly on the table. She glanced at the screen. Grant. For a moment, she simply looked at it. The name didn't carry the same weight anymore. It didn't hurt. It didn't shake her. It was just a name. She answered. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, as if he wasn't expecting her to pick up. "Vivian," Grant said finally. His voice sounded different, less certain. "Yes. I wanted to check in." She waited. "I heard you went back to Virginia." "I did." Another pause. "How are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried something unfamiliar. Genuine curiosity. Vivian looked out the window, sunlight warming her face. "I'm good," she said honestly, and she meant it. Grant didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't the answer he expected. "I see," he said quietly. A silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just clear. "There are some things we need to discuss," he added, shifting back into a more familiar tone. Vivian smiled slightly. "Of course. There always are," she replied gently. Grant hesitated again, then finally said, "The prenuptial agreement wasn't valid." Vivian's expression didn't change. I know, she said calmly. That caught him off guard. You know. Yes. How? Vivian glanced at the documents neatly placed beside her. Because her mother hadn't just left her money. She had left her protection. Advisors. Legal experts. A structure far more powerful than anything Grant had built. I have people helping me now, she said simply. Grant went quiet. Because suddenly, the dynamic had shifted. Completely. Weeks passed. And then months. Grant's empire continued to weaken. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But steadily. Like something slowly losing its foundation. One deal at a time. One partner at a time. Until eventually, there was nothing left to hold it up. Delaney left before the final collapse. Not with drama. Not with apology. Just absence. Because she had never been there for love. Only for what came with it. And when that disappeared, so did she. Grant Whitmore, the man who once controlled everything, found himself standing alone in the same penthouse. But this time, it wasn't a symbol of success. It was a reminder of what he lost and what he failed to understand. In Virginia, life moved forward, peacefully, quietly, but powerfully. Vivian began using her resources carefully, thoughtfully. She didn't announce anything, didn't seek attention. She simply started building prenatal clinics for women who had nowhere else to go, support systems for single mothers, music programs in schools just like her mother would have wanted. Each project carried meaning. Each decision carried intention. And slowly, a new legacy began to take shape. The day her daughter was born, the world felt different, softer, brighter, full. Vivian held her gently, tears of quiet joy filling her eyes. She's perfect, the nurse whispered. Vivian smiled, brushing her fingers across the baby's tiny hand. Her name is Eleanor Ruby, she said softly, a name that carried history, strength, love, not just wealth, but meaning. That night, as she sat by the window holding her daughter, Vivian looked out at the calm Virginia sky. No skyscrapers, no noise, just peace. And in that moment, she understood everything. Grant had believed power came from money, from control, from status. But real power was something else entirely. It was the ability to stand up when life tried to break you, to rebuild without bitterness, to create without destroying, to walk away without losing yourself. Somewhere in the distance, a new day was beginning. And for Vivian, it wasn't about what she had lost. It was about everything she had found. Because the truth was simple. She was never a nobody. She just hadn't seen how powerful she truly was. The story of Vivian reminds us that the most vital inheritance a woman can possess isn't found in a bank account. It's the inner strength to stand tall when the world expects you to stay broken. You were never small. You just didn't know how tall you stood.